it? Am I going in some way to tailor my thinking to the quartet or to the event or what? I ended up deciding I'm just going to write the music that I want to write right now. With hopes, having heard that Tanev, Geraldine Freund brought them into Chicago the year before, and they did a concert. And I was at the concert, so without a doubt, when you hear a quartet or any group or a soloist or whatever play, something about their particular, the collective musical personality that the group has, I think inevitably enters one's compositional approach. But it was not a conscious decision. I just wrote the piece that at that point I felt ready to compose.
Now, that's interesting about how the ensemble that you're writing for, at least subconsciously, impacts the music that comes out. And when I think of the second string quartet and remember learning it, each part is truly almost like a concerto. It's so virtuosic. Was that inspired in some sense? Now, in the two other of your works that I've played, there seems to be a persistent element of virtuosity, but in Vistas particularly, I mean, it's striking how virtuosic each individual part is.
Yeah, I don't think that this necessarily had to do with the quartet for which the piece was commissioned, as much as this is where I was at. And a quartet in particular, a string quartet, there's something about that genre. I mean, first of all, of course, you have a genre that has such great masterpieces written for it that you say to yourself, should I really be daring to put my contribution there? So, of course, I care deeply about every work that I compose. Don't get me wrong. If I would compose a solo piccolo piece, I would put into it my heart and soul. But there is something about something that has the weight of history in the way that the string quartet does, that of course encourages that way of thinking. And when I think about my first string quartet, which was written for the Mendelssohn String Quartet, in their very, very first reincarnation, the Mendelssohn String Quartet, of course.
Was that Laurie's quartet?
Yes, Laurie Snapper. That's right. She was first violinist, and her husband, Ira Weller, was the violist. The second violinist was Nicholas Mann, who stayed with the quartet until they disbanded very recently, after many years. And Marcy Rosen, the wonderful cellist, she was with them that entire period of time. So I know that when I heard them, the Mendelssohn, there was something about how very strong they each were that prompted me to think of the two violins not so much as a first and second violin, but as right and left violin. And they were placed similarly on stage with the viola and cello in a way, kind of what I was thinking of as a back orchestra, but a very, very demanding virtuosic pair as well. So in a way, I was thinking of two pairs. In this case, I wanted to give each one of the, everybody is a protagonist there.
That's right.
And there's so much that you can do with a string quartet, even though it's a homogeneous kind of ensemble, but nonetheless, you can really do very special things with 4 personalities. So it's really something that I want to do. I have other works. For example, there's Excursions, which is a piano trio, and that was written in the early 80s, where it is like a concerto for those 3 instruments. So it's an approach that just felt very Um, Very me, I suppose.
Yes. Have you written any string quartets since then?
Yes, yeah. I wrote a string quartet and I had some more recent piece. I wrote it in 2012, 13. Um, Glitter, Doom, Shards, Memory is the name of the quartet, and it's my third string quartet. And it is in many ways quite different than the other two, and in many ways, I think entirely similar. Because I often, when a conversation comes to somebody's stylistic evolution, I always say that the way I view its style is something that composes individual, personal, whatever, musical DNA. And what people often think of as style to me is language. So you change your language, as you can talk in different languages. I can talk in Hebrew, I can talk in English, and yet I'm the one who's talking. So I think that the third string quartet, in all sorts of ways, uses a different language. But I'm sure that there are lots of ways where it's still whatever it is that I individually bring to a piece of music.
Well, and that's an interesting point. One thing that has always struck me about your music, and that I don't have expertise in, but to me, I always I sense some part of your Israeli heritage in your music. I always hear it. I sort of feel it when I play it in the harmonies. Is that something that you actively try to express through your music? I was reading that you started out or kind of setting Hebrew poems to music. So this is something you've so deeply ingrained in you. So
yeah, but at the same time, it's interesting because earlier on when I said about the second string quartet, about Vistas, that this is where I was at compositionally. So to elaborate a bit, yes, it's true. I started to compose at a very, very early age, and I won't now go into that early period. But there came a point, I was in my mid-teens, but for me, it was already a kind of getting to another stage because I started to compose when I started making up tunes when I was 7, 8. But by the time I was in my mid-teens, I started to more and more absorb, learn and absorb the great revolutions that were happening in musical discourse during that time period, and spreading my wings and learning much more about that which was outside of my own most personal early experience. And I think that that is what I needed to do at that point. So I'm not sure that about those works, you would necessarily make that association that you just referred to of what you're saying, what you're calling my Israeli background, a certain Middle Eastern modality and so on. But at a certain point, and it was really in the most pronounced way, the work that I wrote right before the second string quartet, which was a solo flute piece called East Wind, where something else began in a much more outwardly way. Certainly, it didn't just start out of nothing. And there were a number of works where things were just kind of beginning to inch their way to the point where I was, in a sense, not even aware of it, again, consciously, but in a sense, if in the prior period and over, a couple of important decades for me, I was spreading my wing. There then came a point where I said, okay, now I can in a way synthesize something of those two very powerful strands that are part of who I am. So after composing that sort of flute piece, when time came to write the string quartet, I wanted very much to pursue that. And even the two pieces, plus a third piece that came maybe 3-4 years later, Mirage, which is a quintet, a mixed quintet piece. They even use the same cell, the same melodic cell of a central note, and above that a half step, and below that a whole step. So that particular little nucleus, they are the kernel on which these three works are based. And then came other works that sort of spread out of that, and so on and so on. So that's what I mean when I'm saying that I was in a way there and wanted to pursue that particular
That's interesting. I want to play that cell for people just so that they have those three pitches. Really, that's so. Oh, sorry, I changed my string. So is that cell in some way tied to? Sorry, I changed all my strings today. Is that cell in some way tied to Middle Eastern music? Sorry, the violin's really out of tune, but so those three notes that she's describing, which is that the way that the string quartet was, right? That very intense opening. Interesting.
Yeah. And of course, there were other things that were going on. I wanted to work with the idea of, I was thinking of it as concentric, moving out in waves, where I start with a center and then little by little, I open from there, but I also keep coming back to it. So, that there is that element as well. But to go back to your question, yes, I think that this is one of various elements that one finds in some Middle Eastern modalities.
Interesting. That's very interesting. So let's talk a little. Can you tell us a little bit about Soliloquy?
Yeah, so Soliloquy, it is in a way a piece that it sort of has a dual life. It actually began as a work for violin and string orchestra that I was commissioned to do in 1994. And the violinist who approached me about this, she's an Israeli violinist, Edna Michel, a very fine violinist who had a long-term association with Yehudi Menuhin, the world-renowned great a violinist who in time was no longer playing as much, but was also was conducting and devoting his life to various humanitarian causes. And the two of them had worked a lot together, and she wanted to have a group of composers write works in his honor for his 80th birthday. And she came to me a few years earlier. She said to me, would you consider writing a work along with, there'll be a whole bunch of composers writing short works that would be about love and peace and togetherness. And my first impulse was, that's a lot. How does one write a work about all those great
You need your whole opera.
Right, or at least one. But it's funny that you should say opera, because I said, well, I don't know, I don't think so. I sort of shied away from the idea. But then, so this was in 94. Between 94 and 97, I was wholly absorbed in composing my first opera, Between Two Worlds, The Dybbuk. The Dybbuk is a very, very well-known and iconic Jewish play. We could spend the rest of the time here talking about that, but we won't. But in any case, it's a tale of incredible passion and desire and unrequited love. Requited or requited? Wait a minute. You know the word.
No, I think you're right. I never trust my own pronunciation, but I always say unrequited.
Requited, yeah. Okay, I thought so, but in any case, so I suddenly, after I had completed the opera, Edna had contacted me again, and she said, well, maybe you'd be willing now to think about it. And suddenly the idea, okay, so it doesn't have to be about all those great and lofty ideas, but it can be about the desire for them, the wanting to get to it, which is what the opera is about, that desire, that striving. And so that's when I felt, okay, I can do this. So I wrote that work, and in that reincarnation, it is called Yearning. And it was a few years later that the Peabody Trio, with which I've had a wonderful relationship, with the piano trio, the Peabody, they too have disbanded a couple of years ago. Ensembles very often, you know, they'll work together for a very long time, but it's not necessarily a forever situation. So, but at that time they were very, very busy and active, and still active for a long time afterwards. And they decided to do a disc of the Peabody Trio performing a number of my works. So I have a piano trio called Excursions, which is a large work. So they were going to do that. And there's a solo cello work on the program, on the disc, and a big solo piano piece. And the only one who didn't have a piece, the idea was that this be an all first performance, first recording. So that eliminated a solo violin piece that I have, that was already recorded. And so I suddenly thought to myself, okay, Yearning is for violin and string orchestra. So it is not, and there is a distinctive cello melody there that is very, very important in Yearning. And so I thought to myself, okay, the road from here to a piano trio is not that long. And so I adapted the piece. It's not an exact transcription by any means. The violin is pretty much almost the exact same. But as a whole, there's definitely an adaptation to it. And that's how Soliloquy was born. So Soliloquy is a twin piece of Yearning. Then much more recently, I was approached by the Lincoln Center Chamber Music Society with a request to have Yearning done in one of their concerts. And I said, wait a minute, but this is that's a string orchestra. So it turned out that this was a concert of Daniel Hope, the violinist, with a fabulous group, really an all-star string group, but a total of 11 of them. So I thought to myself, well, okay, I will make a transcription of that. So it became yet a third iteration of that piece. That's very unusual for me. I don't have a music that sort of functions with multiple faces, but that one does. And Yearning in its second version is definitely a work that exists in a sense. It's closer to the Soliloquy, and well,
That's very interesting.
yeah.
I played Soliloquy twice last year. Once on a concert season in Colorado, and then once at the University of Tennessee. And then we were going to do it on our spring fundraiser, which, if my memory serves me right, was something like March 19th, I think. And we were really looking forward. We waited until the day, and the whole COVID situation was just starting to explode
Yep.
here. And the
Yep.
night before, we ended up canceling the performance.
Ah,
So we will have to reschedule that.
what a
We will have to reschedule that performance for some time
yeah,
next year. It
yeah,
was when you first started describing these lofty ideals and loving, and I was thinking of soliloquy. And soliloquy is quite intense. The idea of unrequited love and some struggle makes a lot of sense, though, especially as like the violinist reaches that huge climax at the very end, where it's just really exploding with struggle, and then this kind of peaceful but melancholy in a way,
yeah, yes.
walk
It
walking
actually,
away into the distance.
yeah, it uses certain not themes. Well, it uses certain materials from the opera, from Between Two Worlds, except the main theme is an entirely new piece, a new theme, except it uses the same harmonic. So it's kind of a whole tone-ish.
Exactly.
Yeah, yes, that in the opera is what I call my passion motif.
Nice.
So the two melodies are entirely different, but nonetheless it's the same kind of, again, a certain harmonic DNA in this case. Yeah,
Very interesting.
but it ends literally the way that the opera does.
Okay.
Sort of
Well,
going
I just saw
up,
today.
up,
Yes, it really does.
yeah.
I never messed up that last note. I'd always sounded pretty good when I performed it, but I was always worried the week. I was like, that's a really high last note. As you're walking away and getting quieter and quieter and quieter.
I tend to do that and deliberate is not because I want to make the life for the performer too challenging or trying, but because I guess in at least some of my music, my violin concerto does that too. Climbs all the way up. It starts, the violin concerto starts on an F, but ends on a high E sharp, which of course is the same
Yeah.
pitch as an F, yeah, but it sort of gets there. And it is what it is, as they say.
So, talk to us a little bit about the Lyre of Orpheus, which is your 2008 sextet, in which we performed
Yeah,
at the festival last year.
yeah. So, Lyre of Orpheus was commissioned by Concertante, a string sextet, a New York-based string sextet. I have the feeling that they are no longer acting as a group either. What a shame it is. I mean, all these great groups, but then there are other great groups that
This is the story
spring
of chamber
up.
music.
Yes, it is. It is. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, it's a great, was a great string sextet. And they had this idea of having six composers compose a sextet for them, each one of them focusing on another one of their players. Even though their two violinists were equals. I mean, it was not a case where there was a first violin and a second violin. I mean, there may be in a piece, but as a group, and the two violists and the two cellists. And the cellist that was part of the sextet and who I was asked to write for is Tzvi Plesser, who is a fabulous Israeli cellist who for a good while was also spending good parts of the year in the United States. And he has the most beautiful sound and great technique and all those great things. Now, the second cellist was great too, and I wanted to give her some important stuff as well. So I ended up, which I may well have done anyway, I wanted to extend the range of the cello downward, so that this, what I'm doing is the second cello uses scordatura, going down to the low A. From the low C. So there are a few extra notes which what did I say? Going down from the low C to the low A.
Well, that's it. We forgot to mention in soliloquy. In soliloquy, I believe the cello is the same
Right.
thing.
That's
Yeah,
right.
I
Yeah,
forgot
yeah. Those are my two pieces of those scored tour. Yeah,
about
yeah. It's great to use that bottom range where the cello, in a sense, has almost a kind of a double bass sound to it.
Well, it changes the resonance of the
It
instrument
changes the
quite a bit to have
yeah,
those two
yeah.
A strings.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. So in any case, so Lyre of Orpheus is a piece where the cello, it's in a way almost like a cello concerto, but of course everyone has things to do that keep them quite busy. Quite
Nobody is bored.
no, nobody's spared, no one gets off free. So yeah, so I mean, about the title, I have to say, I mean, in case you think, in thinking about the piece, that maybe I started with the idea of somehow doing something with that tale of Orpheus. No, I wrote the piece. And then I was thinking, okay, what am I going to call this piece? I sort of played around with a couple of titles, and then suddenly it hit me that in some sense, there is so much about the piece that reminds one that you can make that association with the author's story.
Yes.
And Eurydice, you could think of her as the violin. And at the end, you almost feel as though the two are pulling one another. In any case, it occurred to me at the time that it's interesting how some of those iconic tales, they seem to have such a resonance with the kinds of emotions and experiences that we as human beings feel.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. And thinking about that expanded range of the cello a little bit, in the first cello part, you really go all the way to the maximum of the cello's upper range as well. So
Yeah.
with that scordatura, you've really explored the full scope of kind of what a cello can do. So
Yeah, yeah, and there is that point, a really key point, where you have a big buildup of all six instruments, where they get almost into a kind of ecstatic buildup, getting more and more intense, and that ends with the two cellos having a kind of a cadenza of sorts, where they just flip flop on the other, and then out of that, and then they kind of both are very low. They both go to the lowest register, kind of deep in the bottom. And out of that, the cello, the first cello, the principal cello, here kind of comes out in a big cadenza.
I can recall that cadenza right now, actually. Well, that's very interesting. Since we've been talking for a while, I want to open up the floor to our listeners and see if anybody else has a question. Anybody out there? Sally.
Just a comment.
Hi.
Hi, Shulamit.
Hi, Sally.
Hi. What a treat this is to be able to look at you at a distance, and all the rest of us. But hear you speak about your work in such an open and inviting way that is evocative and full of images. And I guess that's what is so compelling about being able to hear the mind of a creator, which you are. And I was thinking about your comment about language, and also now listening to you and Jeff speak about the violin in this particular work as having transcribing the feeling of yearning, right? And what that is. So experiencing it as a listener, right, as an audience person, you're hearing it. Maybe you're acute enough to watch the violinist and how high he or she is going on the neck, and how tentative in a way that could be, as Jeff was describing. Oops, I hope I make it, but this and now I bring it back to our. I'm not actually asking a question. I'm just making some comments based on what you said and what I'm hearing. But this business of being able to express yearning and that which we are all experiencing now, what is it that we're seeking? What is it that we're missing? What is it that we're isn't happening for us? And certainly that's not being able to be together, except usually on screens. Right. But isn't it a byproduct that could be perceived as reasonably positive, that we can have this kind of session, which we would not have in a concert hall? Or
you're so right. Yeah, while I was saying something much earlier when the question came up about how I'm dealing with this period of time, and I talked about the devastation aspect of so much that is going on, and the arts being definitely an area that's going to be hard hit. But then I thought to myself, I should say something, but then somehow my mind went elsewhere, and so I didn't say that in all of this, there is hope too. People will come up and are coming up with great ways of coping as well, of creating these kinds of situations, of playing where you have different players in different places and nonetheless are coming together virtually. The human imagination, the human mind has just an endless, limitless capacity to take things further and to reimagine things and to find heretofore untried solutions. So yes, definitely, you're so right. Here we are doing this, which is so great.
Yes.
Well, I
love connecting with people who are audience, part of that group of people, whether tiny or whether large, who want to come together in the experience of music, who want to share music and ideas and emotion. So yeah, that is so true.
Thank you.
You're right. Thank you.
I think there will definitely be some good things that come out of this for arts organizations. I think among the things that arts organizations have struggled with over the years is being innovative and using the full scope of technology to their benefit.
Yes.
And now very quickly we found that there's all sorts of things we can do with technology, and right now we're solely existing on those. But even when we go back to being
Normal.
Yeah, normal, I think they can be so helpful to us. And I was just envisioning, I saw you on the YouTube video of the Lyre of Orpheus, you gave a pre-concert talk, right? And it's often
Yeah,
hard,
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
it's often very hard to get busy people to come to your part of the world to speak. And I was just envisioning, I don't know how cool that would be if the next time we play one of your pieces, there's no like our concert hall has a screen in it. There's no reason we couldn't do a pre-concert talk just like this in the concert hall. There's
Absolutely.
all different
Yeah, compose almost by definition. They love talking. I mean, even if they don't like talking at all, but they love that open conversation with the people who perform their music, with audience members. We do what we do. It's in a way such a solitary line of work, if you could call it that. It is such a solitary existence that a composer leads, and yet it never feels, to me anyway, it never feels lonely. Solitary is not the same as lonely. And so there is always a performer at the end of the tunnel there. And then when you get together with performers and you make music and you see, in my case, witnessing the people who are bringing my music to life, it's an intensely gratifying experience. And then from there, it goes to the listener, and seeing how people react and what people want to know and so on. It's exciting, and I think that most composers feel that way. So you probably have many composers who will happily take you up. Yeah.
Well, so that's very interesting. I asked Jennifer Higdon a similar question last week. Our theme last year was women in music.
Uh-huh.
And thankfully today the opportunities for women in music have changed quite a bit. And
yeah, I mean, there are so many women composing, creating at the highest level. And, finally the world is getting it, that it's really not about a gender, it's about what it is one does.
And do you have any, I don't know, thoughts on that subject? Have you seen things change over the course of your career? Just any kind of comment you have on the subject matter would be very interesting. Because in a certain sense, there's still, and Philly Orchestra got in big hot water last year. Front page, I think it was Washington Post or something of their art section. 0 women composers on the 2019-2020 season for Philadelphia Orchestra. But anyways, I would just love to hear your thoughts on the subject.
I'll tell you one thing. First of all, as far as myself, I was very, very lucky, because I grew up in a home, my parents were incredibly supportive. They always taught me the sky is the limit. There was never a sense as though, well, those are not things you're supposed to do. Similarly, growing up in Israel, it was never really an issue. There were women in every walk of life. Including in the army, and later on a minister in the cabinet who became a prime minister, Golda Meir. So that there was very much the feeling that people were part of the fabric of society in a way that, made for, nobody really talked about that. How come, So I became more aware of it actually coming to this country, coming to the United States. That's when people started to ask much more the question, what's it like being, well, at that time I was a girl, really, a very young woman, a composer. But I think by then, in a sense, my sense of self, of the confidence, I don't mean to imply that I'm going around with just tons of confidence. No one is, and I would be very suspicious of anyone who does. But I mean, in the sense of being a woman, that's I grew up never feeling that that was an issue. And so I think it was very important to have grown up that way and then to come to where it was a little less obvious. But already by then, you know, this was not going to thwart my efforts. But there is no question that you just see so many more women. I think that these decades have brought great change in many, many ways, and the women are doing everything, and there are far more women going for composition programs at universities, and there's a very, very high level. Women have been winning awards left and right. You mentioned earlier that I was the second woman to have won the Pulitzer. And on one occasion, because of something that somebody asked me, I sort of looked at the list of Pulitzer Prize winning, and it narrows exponentially, because there was Ellen Zwillig, who was the first one to win the Pulitzer woman. And then it took a few years, and then it was me. And then the next one still took a few years, but a little bit less so, Melinda Wagner, who actually was a student of mine. And then things suddenly started to get much, much, much closer. And it's just, whoop. So I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Pulitzer is the one way in which you judge things, not at all. But I'm just giving this as an example, as a kind of obvious an example. But yeah, it's taken a long time. There is no question about it, that when you look at the history of music, it has been shamefully long. But I think that now we are in an era where the music makers, the music that make the decisions, as time goes, it's younger and younger people who are doing so, and who are less, they have a different outlook on the whole issue of gender. So I think it's really just a matter of time before it will be, it's getting to more and more to be an even playing field.
Yes.
Certainly, there's so much out there that there's no excuse not to.
When I was programming last season, I always talk about how you just uncover endless amounts of fantastic music, like trying to sort through it and decide what to play was a very difficult decision, because there's so much great stuff out there, and even works from the late 19th century and early 20th century. There was some very good music that's out there that's not played so much, but then as you approach today, I mean, there's just so much fantastic music being written.
Yeah, that's right. And I think one of the big problems is a general problem of many orchestras, the big orchestras, that don't do much contemporary music. So everybody loses.
Well, this is an interesting point, isn't it? There's this sort of trope that the general audience doesn't really care for contemporary music, and I remember when I was a student in Houston, I started a contemporary music ensemble, and to raise some money, we went out into the suburbs and did some house concerts for people who really didn't know much about classical music at all. And I mean, one of the pieces our cellist played Sarajevo Butterflies, which is a piece for solo cello that uses all extended technique, and we played some Pierre Jalbert. I forget our whole program, but these are people, I think if we had went out there and played Mozart, they would have thought to themselves like, oh, this is elevator music, this is boring. And because we were playing contemporary music, they actually had no preconceived notion about it whatsoever, and they loved it. And we raised quite a bit of money. It was fantastic. And they kept inviting us back to do different sorts of house concerts. But I think arts organizations have to get over this idea
Yes.
that people don't like contemporary music. I'm not sure
Yeah,
that's
you have to
true.
recycle the same hit parade of
Exactly.
19th century. Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely true. I think that very often with young people or with people who don't have any particular musical experience, as you say, they come with open ears, and very often they gravitate more towards music that was written at our time. They find somehow more of a commonality.
Yep. Well, any other comments or questions for Shulamit?
Yes, I have one.
Sure.
Shulamit, when you discuss your music, you always talk about the relationship between you and the performers. And it's only once in your discussion here that you mentioned the audience. And I think that's very important that composers really do connect with the performers and
yes.
let the performers take their music to the audience and not
Yeah.
worry about the audience. So questions that are like, what do you think your music should be like, and should we write for the audience? They seem to go away when you really meet professionals doing the job.
Yeah, it's all really a matter of how one somehow, how something seems to come out of one's mouth at a particular point. But something that I've always felt is really central. And for years I was saying it to my students, I was saying, people talk about, so who is it that the composer stays, whatever that is? Is it other composers? Is it critics? Is it the audience? So I take the point that the performer is that critical element that takes the music from the composer to the audience. And it makes all the difference in the world if the performance is one that is truly committed, genuinely there for the music and not just kind of playing the notes. And I'm convinced that if that happens, then the audience will be receptive, will take it in. So when you're saying that I only mentioned the audience once, I didn't realize that I only mentioned it once, but in any case, rest assured that I see that performer thing as two things: the relationship with the performer. I mean, the performer, after all, that is the person or ensemble that gets to know the piece most intimately. They live with the piece in order to perform it well. They really have to internalize it. So they know if the piece is one that they find stimulating, interesting, worthwhile, putting all that time. What else do we have that is as important than time? So you have the actual, composer, performer, but then performer as that which brings the music to the audience. So it's intricately bound. Can't really separate all of them. And thank you, because that's totally right.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Well, if there's nobody else, Shulamit, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And
it's a great pleasure.
Like,
Thank you
like
for
we-
having me too.
like we mentioned, how neat that we get to connect in this way. I was going to play your music this year, but I probably wasn't going to speak to you. And now because of this situation, we got to reconnect, and I hope we'll connect again this year when we program your music. And your willingness to talk about your work and your openness is just really wonderful. And like I said,
it's a great pleasure. And earlier on when I said, you said something about the concert that was canceled, and I said, oh, what a shame, what a shame. The shame is that a concert had to be canceled. It was such a special thing to happen, and hopefully you get back to it are able to get back to it safely and soon.
We're hoping. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Really wonderful. We appreciate you coming and chatting with Shulamit. And we'll hopefully see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Very, very much, Jeff.
Yeah.
Thank you, and all the best to you and to all.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.